Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah, great to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I think has captivated so many of us, probably since you were kids. We're going to be talking about the future of space tourism.
Yeah.
And in particular, we're going to be looking at this question of, will we all get to go to space one day?
Right.
Or is it going to be, just something that's always exclusive for, the super rich or, people who work for government space agencies?
Yeah.
We're going to be drawing on a podcast episode that we found called The Future of Space Tourism. Will we all travel to space one day? With the subtitle, Exploring the Next Frontier. And it is jam-packed with information, so we're going to be covering as much as we can today.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting to think about, going back to our childhoods. I mean, the idea of space travel has always been so captivating.
It has, and I think right from the earliest days when we were using telescopes to, peer into the night sky and catch glimpses of other worlds, it's really gripped us. And then obviously once we started, launching artificial satellites, and then of course, the monumental achievement of landing people on the moon.
Yeah.
It's always been this kind of frontier that we're yearning to explore further.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, now we so easily take for granted the fact that we're living in the space age. Like we've had, satellites and men on the moon.
Yes.
But going back even just a few decades, before all of this, I mean, it really was the stuff of science fiction.
It was.
And so, it's really been quite a rapid progression.
Yeah, it has.
And one thing that our podcast episode source talks about is that really at the beginning of this century, things started to change a bit, right?
They did.
In 2001, Dennis Tito, who, I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of him, maybe not. He became the first space tourist.
Right.
And I think this is kind of an interesting milestone because he reportedly paid something like $20 million for a trip to the International Space Station.
Wow.
On a Russian Soyuz spacecraft. So that really highlights, the exclusivity
It does.
of space travel up to that point.
Yeah, definitely. And it was really him kind of blazing a trail because since then, a handful of other obviously very wealthy individuals have followed in his footsteps. And that's really, what we could call, the very early stages of this private space travel industry emerging.
Yeah, I mean, $20 million, that's just...
It's a lot.
Such a huge barrier entry. So, yeah, so that really brings us to the main focus of what we want to discuss today,
Right.
Which is, how far have we come since then, and how much further do we need to go to make space tourism something that the average person could actually consider.
Yeah.
And the podcast source talks about a number of companies that are really kind of the key players that are working towards this. And the first one they mentioned is Virgin Galactic,
Right.
Founded by Richard Branson. And they're focused on suborbital flights using their Spaceship Two vehicle.
Yeah.
And, so what they're really offering, I guess the kind of unique selling point for them is this idea that you can go up high enough to experience a few minutes of weightlessness.
Yeah.
You can see the curvature of the Earth against the blackness of space. So it's not like, going into orbit or anything.
Yeah.
It's really kind of like, I guess a very, very intense kind of roller coaster ride almost.
Yeah, it's that kind of quick, almost like a taste of what space travel could be like.
Yeah, it's like a taster menu, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So that's Virgin Galactic. Then we have Blue Origin, which was founded by Jeff Bezos. And they're also focused on suborbital space with their New Shepard rocket.
Right.
And their motto is really interesting, for the benefit of Earth.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of makes you wonder, okay, what exactly do they have in mind?
Yeah, what's the bigger picture there?
Yeah. Like what are they ultimately working towards?
Yeah.
And I think, in terms of what they're offering right now, it's actually quite similar to Virgin Galactic. It's these suborbital flights.
Right.
They're really focused on reusability with their New Shepard rocket,
Yeah.
which I guess in theory could help to lower costs over time.
Yeah, that's the hope.
But we haven't really seen that materialize yet.
Right.
But then we have kind of the big, player that I think a lot of people are really excited about,
Right.
which is SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk.
Hmm.
And they're really not just aiming for suborbital hops, right? I mean, they've already sent, civilians into Earth orbit
Yeah,
using their Crew Dragon capsule. And their goals are way bigger than that.
they are.
Yeah.
I mean, their aspirations, they're so far-reaching that it's almost mind-boggling to try and wrap your head around them. And you're right. The orbital missions that they're doing, that's already a huge step up
Yeah.
from, just those suborbital trips. You're talking, much longer duration flights,
Yeah.
higher altitudes. But then, beyond that, you have these planned private lunar missions,
Yeah.
like the Dear Moon Project, which the goal of that is to send a crew of artists
Wow.
and other civilians
Oh, interesting.
on a voyage around the moon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then, of course, the ultimate goal
Yeah.
for Elon Musk is to establish this self-sustaining human presence on Mars.
Yeah, I think that's one that's gonna, that's so long term, it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to wrap our heads around it, but
Yeah.
it's certainly ambitious.
It's incredibly ambitious.
And then, beyond those three players, there's a couple of other companies that are working on things that are a little bit different.
Right.
So there's Axiom Space,
Mhm.
and they're focused on building the first commercial space station.
Right.
And so they're not just thinking about short tourist flights, they're thinking about, a facility that could be used for scientific research
Yeah.
and also, eventually could accommodate space tourists, staying for potentially longer periods.
Yeah.
And then there's Orbital Assembly Corporation,
Mhm.
and they're really thinking even further ahead with this concept of a space hotel.
Yeah.
So imagine this. Actual hotels in space. You've got artificial gravity, luxurious accommodations, and you wake up and you look out the window and you see the Earth.
That's incredible.
It's like science fiction.
Yeah, it's really pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible, and the idea of artificial gravity. That's a game changer, because that could really mitigate a lot of those health challenges that are associated with prolonged periods in space. Yeah. So that makes longer stays much more feasible and much more comfortable, obviously, for the tourists.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how much thought they're putting into that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the ideas is that they would rotate the space station essentially,
Yeah.
or the hotel,
Yeah.
to create centrifugal force that would simulate gravity.
Right.
So they're aiming for these hotels to potentially be operational as early as the 2030s, which doesn't seem that far off.
It's not. No, when you think about it, it's just around the corner.
Yeah. But, I think we've talked about all these companies, and it all sounds very exciting.
Right.
But there is one major barrier that we have to address,
Yeah.
and that's the cost.
The cost, yeah.
The podcast episode that we're looking at makes it very clear that right now space travel is incredibly expensive.
Yeah, it's definitely a luxury for the ultra-wealthy.
Yeah, so you're talking, about $450,000 for a suborbital flight with Virgin Galactic,
Wow.
which is, only a few minutes.
Yeah.
Then if you're talking about an orbital journey with SpaceX, you're talking $50 million, potentially even more.
Yeah.
And then a stay at one of these space hotels in the future, potentially several $1,000,000 per night.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's clear that it's not accessible to the average person at this point.
No, not at all.
But, the podcast episode does draw this interesting parallel
Okay.
with the early days of air travel.
Okay. Yeah.
So when airplanes were first invented, flying was this incredibly expensive,
Yeah.
exclusive activity. Only, the very rich and famous could afford it. But, over time, technology advanced.
Yeah.
Production increased, demand grew. And, as a result of all of that, the cost of air travel came down dramatically.
Right.
To the point where now, it's something that's relatively affordable for many people.
Yeah.
And so the hope is that a similar trend
Yeah.
will play out
Yeah.
with space travel.
That is a hopeful analogy, but I guess, it makes me think about the fact that, I mean, air travel was really just a continuation of, we already had engines.
Right.
We're already pretty good at that sort of thing. Space travel is so much more,
Yeah.
kind of cutting edge and new.
Yeah, it's a completely different scale of engineering and technological challenges. You're talking about, the immense energy that's required
Yeah.
to escape Earth's gravity.
Right.
The complexities of life support systems in space.
Yeah.
And it's so different from anything that we've we've done before.
Mm.
So while reusability is definitely helping,
Yeah.
it's bringing the cost down a little bit. We're still dealing with technologies that are really at the very cutting edge of what's possible.
Right.
Which, inherently that makes the development costs high. The operational costs are high. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
It makes you think, if we do, let's say that the cost does eventually come down.
Right.
But it's still a significant investment.
Yeah.
That's going to create this kind of, continuation of the economic divide.
Yeah.
Right? Where only certain people have access. So it's, it raises this question of, is that just how it's going to be?
Right.
Or is there some way to kind of, address that and think about it in terms of, is space a public good?
Right.
Is it something that everyone should have access to?
It's a big question. And there are definitely different perspectives on this.
Yeah.
You have some people who argue that, our priorities should really be focused on solving problems here on Earth.
Right.
We have so many challenges here. Climate change.
Yeah.
Global poverty.
Yeah.
Disease. Why are we spending all these resources
on
space travel when we have so much work to do right here at home?
Yeah.
That's a very valid argument.
Yeah.
But then you also have people who, they argue that, the pursuit of space travel, it actually can be this incredible engine for innovation.
Right.
You think about the advancements in materials science,
Yeah.
communication technologies, medical breakthroughs.
Yeah.
A lot of that has come from our space programs.
Yeah.
So it can actually have benefits here on Earth as well.
Yeah. And, and some people take it even a step further and they say, what if something happens to Earth?
Right.
And we need a backup plan.
Yeah, the space is a lifeboat
Right.
idea. It sounds a bit far-fetched, but it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility.
Right.
And there's this other kind of middle ground perspective that I found really interesting in the podcast.
Okay.
Which is this idea that maybe space travel isn't just about leaving Earth.
Right.
It's about gaining a deeper understanding and appreciation of it.
Yeah.
When you see our planet from space, it can really change your perspective.
Yeah.
It can inspire you to be a better steward of our home world.
Right.
So it becomes not just about, leaving.
Yeah.
But about, expanding our human story.
Right.
And our understanding of our place in the universe.
Yeah. So I think that, kind of brings us to this next point, which is, aside from the cost, there's also this question of, what about the environmental impact?
The environmental impact, yeah.
I think it's easy to get swept up in the, the excitement of space travel and not really think about the environmental consequences.
Right.
But the podcast episode really highlights that each rocket launch, it releases a substantial amount of carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the atmosphere.
Yeah, and not just the, it's the fact that those emissions, they go directly into the upper atmosphere.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of concern about the potential long-term effects on the ozone layer.
Right.
And on global climate patterns.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing, too, is we're talking about a lot of soot particles from these rockets accumulating in the stratosphere. And, we don't really fully understand what the long-term consequences of that might be.
Right.
And right now, the volume of space tourism flights is relatively low.
It is.
But, if the industry grows as projected, these emissions could become a really significant environmental concern.
Yeah, and that really forces us to ask ourselves, are the potential benefits of space exploration and tourism worth the potential environmental cost?
Yeah.
Is it an acceptable trade-off?
Yeah, it's an ethical question, isn't it?
It is.
And, it's good that, I think the podcast episode does mention that there's ongoing work on sustainable innovations, like green propellants and reusable rockets.
Right.
But there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, there's a lot more progress needed in that area.
Now that we've kind of talked about, the health of the planet, I think it's also important to talk about the individual human experience in space.
Yeah.
Because, it's not just a physical journey. It's also very much a psychological one.
It is.
And the podcast episode talks about this fascinating thing called the overview effect.
The overview effect, yeah.
So can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the overview effect is this this phenomenon that's been reported by a lot of astronauts,
Okay.
where they see the Earth from space,
Yeah.
and they have this really profound shift in perception.
Wow.
They talk about these intense feelings of awe,
Okay.
and a really deep sense of interconnectedness with all life on Earth, and a really powerful realization of just how fragile our planet is,
Wow.
and its place in the cosmos. So, it's this perspective-altering experience that can, really fundamentally change their worldview.
It's almost, you hear them talking about it, and it sounds almost like a spiritual experience.
It's still, yeah.
Like an awakening of some sort.
Yeah.
And the podcast episode even speculates on the idea that if more people could have this experience,
Right.
If it wasn't just limited to astronauts,
Yeah.
what kind of collective impact would that have?
Right.
Would it make us more, kind of globally minded and aware of our interconnectedness?
Right.
But obviously it's not all roses and amazing views.
Yeah, there are definitely some potential downsides as well.
Yeah.
The podcast transcript talks about, some of the psychological challenges associated with space travel. So, prolonged isolation.
Right.
You're in this confined environment for a long time.
Yeah.
Potential sensory deprivation.
Okay.
There's not a whole lot of stimulation in space.
Right.
The challenges of spatial disorientation,
Yeah.
up and down kind of lose their meaning.
Yeah.
There's also space anxiety, which, that's a real thing.
Yeah.
Motion sickness. And then even, there's some research that suggests that there could be cognitive changes on longer missions.
Yeah.
So it's important to remember that space, it's not just, physically extreme, it's also psychologically extreme.
Yeah. I think, we've got this image from movies and things
Right.
like, Star Trek or whatever,
Yeah.
where everyone's just like walking around in space and everything's fine.
Yeah,
But in reality, I mean, it's a very hostile environment.
it is.
And it would take, a very specific type of person to, I think, be able to handle that.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see, as space tourism develops,
Yeah.
how they address those psychological challenges.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think, kind of looking forward a little bit.
Right.
What does the future hold? I mean, the podcast episode paints this picture of, lunar tourism,
Right.
potentially hotels in space, operational in the 2030s
Yeah.
with simulated gravity and being able to look out and see the Earth.
Yeah.
But it even goes further than that.
It does.
So, we're talking about SpaceX's Dear Moon project, where they want to send a group of artists and other civilians around the moon.
Right.
And then, of course, there's Elon Musk's idea of, an actual colony on Mars.
Yeah, that's the really big one.
Yeah.
And it's a huge vision.
It is.
And it's hard to know, how realistic it is
Yeah.
or what the timeline would be.
Yeah.
But, he certainly seems to be, putting a lot of resources behind it.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because we're already seeing, with the suborbital flights and things like that,
Yeah.
people are willing to pay a lot of money
Right.
for these experiences.
Yeah.
So, it's not inconceivable that, if there was a way to get to Mars and it was relatively safe,
Yeah.
there would be people willing to pay for it.
Yeah, I think there would be a market for it for sure.
Yeah, but I think, beyond Mars, the podcast even talks about even crazier ideas.
Oh yeah.
Like asteroid mining.
Asteroid mining, yeah.
Becoming a tourist destination.
Yeah, like going out and,
What?
and seeing, these mining operations in space.
I know, it's wild to think about.
It's wild.
And then they even talk about this idea of like interplanetary cruises, like
Yeah.
Star Trek meets Carnival Cruise Lines.
Right. Yeah, it's like taking, the cruise ship experience and putting it in space.
Yeah, with stops at different planets.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing.
I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like.
It's hard to even picture it.
It really is. But it does raise this question of, just because we can do it, does that mean that we should?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, should we be focusing all of our energy on these ambitious, space endeavors when we have so many problems here on Earth?
Right.
The podcast episode talks about that, and I think it's a valid point.
It is. Yeah, and it's, it's this fundamental philosophical question.
Yeah.
Why? Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
What's the ultimate goal?
Yeah.
Um, and the podcast kind of presents both sides of the argument.
Right.
On the one hand, you have this, the perspective that we should be focusing on solving problems here on Earth.
Yeah.
That's where our priorities should lie.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you have the perspective that, space exploration, it can actually drive innovation
Right.
that benefits Earth. So, it's not necessarily an either or.
Right.
It could be a both and.
Yeah. And there's also this other point that they make, which is, what if Earth becomes uninhabitable?
Right.
What if we need to find somewhere else to go?
Yeah, space as a backup plan.
Yeah.
It sounds like science fiction, but
it does.
It's not impossible.
Right.
And if we're not investing in space exploration,
yeah,
then we won't have that option.
Right.
If we need it.
Yeah.
And then I really like this last point that they made in the podcast, which is, maybe it's not just about leaving Earth.
Right.
Maybe it's about gaining a better understanding
Yeah.
and appreciation of it.
Yeah.
When you see our planet from space, it really changes your perspective.
Yeah.
And it might make you a better steward of our home world.
Right.
So it's not just about, escaping.
Yeah.
It's about expanding our human story.
Yeah.
And our understanding of our place in the cosmos.
Yeah. It's really, it's hard to even imagine what it would be like to see the Earth from space.
It is.
It's something that so few people have had the opportunity to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really powerful idea.
Yeah. It's a very powerful image.
So I guess, kind of wrapping up, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, yeah.
What are your final thoughts on where space tourism is headed?
Well, I mean, based on everything that we've talked about today, it seems like, widespread, affordable space travel
right.
for the masses, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But the idea that it could become a reality within our lifetime,
yeah,
that seems increasingly likely. The podcast emphasizes that it's still very early days.
Right.
We're kind of in that early aviation phase.
Right.
But the momentum is definitely building.
Right.
Technology's advancing.
Yeah.
Costs are coming down.
Yeah.
And there's a growing demand for this experience.
Yeah, and they even speculate on, these almost unbelievable possibilities like, school trips to orbit,
Yep.
lunar honeymoons.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Honeymoon on the moon.
Yeah, or even like a gap year
Yep.
spent on Mars.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds crazy now, but who knows?
Yeah. Who knows what the future holds?
Yeah.
It's so exciting to think about all the possibilities.
Yeah, and I think, really the final thought that I would leave everyone with is that, the future of space travel, it's not this distant thing in a galaxy far, far away.
Right.
It's happening now.
It's happening right now.
Right here on the edge of Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.